Hello everyone, and welcome back. Once again, I am your instructor, Vernon Creviston, and in today's lecture, we're going to look at a new region of English colonization, what we today call the New England region. And what we're going to do is kind of compare and contrast it against the region we looked at last time, the Virginia region or the Chesapeake region. Remember, we looked at Virginia as kind of an extension of that area, as the model, if you will, for the other colonies in that area, how they'll do things. Keep in mind, Virginia was the one that establishes the idea of giving away land to get people to come to your colonies. That one of the things that people want to do with that land is grow a cash crop, tobacco. To do that, they need a lot of land, which they'll take from the Native Americans. But more than that, you also need labor. At first, the majority of that labor was from fellow Englishmen, what we today call indentured servants. But eventually, as more and more indentured servants flooded into the colony, a lot of the big tobacco growers, a lot of the big landed wealthy people that controlled the colonial government decided that that was actually not in their interests, having all these indentured servants around, that they'd want more land, they'd become competitors, grow too much tobacco, depress the prices, and just cause political problems, as a thing called Bacon's Rebellion kind of pointed out to them. So they started turning to a labor alternative that was there from almost the beginning. Remember, 1619 is when slavery was introduced to the Virginia colony, but it didn't really take off in a big way originally. It was kind of in the background. Indentured servants were just cheaper and easier to maintain. But by the 1670s, a lot of English settlers in the Virginia colony and the other colonies around it decided that using enslaved Africans made a better economic sense for them. They could control them, pass laws that gave them absolute power and authority over that group of people, and really helped build their wealth. So Virginia established a lot of models. It created a lot of the fundamental underpinnings of what the United States will be. Virginia is a place where you kind of went for adventure. Virginia is the place where you went to seek your fortune. And of course, Virginia is the place that helped make slavery instrumental in building this nation, right? The original kind of importation of slavery starts there in Virginia. Well, just like Virginia was important to understanding the southern colonies, as they'll be called, today we have to look at another group of colonies, the New England colonies, and what's happening there. And to kind of start that exploration and understanding how that world is going to work and look, we'll look at the title slide here in the picture that's on it. Now remember, we're going to do a lot of this comparing and contrasting with Virginia, so you'll kind of want to keep fresh in your mind what we had just looked at in the Virginia colony lecture. But if you remember in the Virginia Colony lecture, on the title slide of that particular lecture, I had a picture of the first settlers coming to Jamestown as kind of an artist's conceptualization of it. English soldiers and adventurers coming off the ships, coming onto the shore of Virginia and interacting with the natives, either peacefully trading with them or going to war with them and fighting with them. But that was kind of the ideas behind what the Virginia colony was. One way or another, Englishmen were coming to seek their fortune. Well, here we have another picture of English colonists coming to the New World. And there are some similarities here. Once again, we have English people coming onto the shores of the New World. Once again, we have ships in the background that are bringing these Europeans, these people from England, to the New World. But then there's a lot of differences. In this particular picture for today's lecture, there are no Native Americans that we can tell of in this picture. Another thing that is different, while there are English men in this picture, definitely, front and center is an English man, but there are also English women and English children. So from the very beginnings, we can see there is something different about New England that we didn't see in Virginia's start. Now, don't get me wrong, both colonies, Virginia and what is eventually going to be New England, both these different areas are English. They speak English, they have the same kings and queens, they have the same laws and economic systems. All of that's the same. Heck, they even have often the same religions, although that can be a little different, right? There can be different emphases there. And that's what we kind of want to look at today. Because if Virginia was really an economic engine, right, an economic choice, New England region, these colonies that are going to make up New England, are something different. And we can kind of see that in this picture. Again, an artist rendering, an artist conceptualization here, but we have these English Protestants coming off their ship to establish their colonies in New England, and the first thing they do is come together as a group and give thanks that they've made it, that they're alive, and that they're ready to start their mission of building their new home. So they gather around and they pray. They have a religious service. And that is kind of at the core of these early years of New England, of these colonies. Religion is going to be an incredibly important part of this. That is going to be the driving force at the beginning. But it can only be the driving force for so long, as we'll kind of see. Other factors kind of come in and start building on that and changing in some ways what it means to be New England. So that's what we're going to do today, is kind of explore this world called New England and what it makes up. Now, the first thing or a couple of things I really want to point out here is, first of all, New England is a region kind of to what is today the American Northeast, especially along the eastern seaboard of the United States. One way to kind of think about it here is this orange colony here in the middle. That is the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, what is today eventually going to be the state of New York today. That was originally claimed by the Dutch. And then there was that little Swedish colony of Fort Christina that the Dutch took over. So they really kind of control this area of what is kind of the Hudson River Valley in New Jersey today. The English have established their colony of Virginia. Starts out with the Jamestown settlement in 1607, but by the 1640s has grown into a fairly large colony comprising the area of what is today Virginia. North of it is another English colony called Maryland that starts about 30 years after the English settlements at Jamestown start. What we want to do is kind of compare this region called the Chesapeake with this region called New England. Because what you should notice here is in this region called New England, we don't just have one colony or even two like the Chesapeake. We actually have 3, 4, 5 little colonies, right? And also something else to kind of take a look at here. Jamestown is established in 1607. Other settlements in what is the Virginia colony come along in the next 10, 20, 30 years. By the 1630s, there's a second colony called Maryland. But look at this. 1620, you have the first of these English settlers coming to Plymouth. By 1623, you have another group of English colonists in Salem and around that area. Then by 1630, this settlement of Boston is created, and what is called the Massachusetts Bay Colony is incorporated in 1630. And then you have the Rhode Island Colony of 1636. You have the Hartford Colony in 1636 as well, New Haven in 1637. What we should notice is those dates are very compacted. There's a lot of settlements in a fairly large region in a very short period of time. So to kind of focus in on this and help explain what's going on here, look at kind of this close-up map, a little bit more of an actual geographic map with much more defined areas here. Here we see that for the most part, what happens in this New England region only takes about 20, 30 years max to create about 5 different colonies. What we'll know of is the states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and eventually Maine. There are settlements being created all through that region during this period. So while the English are having a rough time, a really long, hard slog of developing the Chesapeake region, the Virginia and Maryland, into functional colonies that can kind of grow on their own, here in the New England region, they are just taking off. Within 10, 12, 15 years of setting up these colonies, they're already expanding and creating new colonies. Where Virginia can create 4 settlements, New England is going to have 4 colonies. So that it is incredible growth that we're looking at here. And to understand that, we really kind of need to understand who these people are, what's driving them, and of course, what's different about their populations that makes them so much more successful, at least on a geographic scale, than what happened in Virginia. Because in the end, Virginia and the New England region have a lot of the same issues. They have a bunch of English people coming over that don't know anything about the environment they're living in. You have a bunch of natives that aren't going to be very appreciative of people coming in and taking their lands and fighting with them and killing them and forcing them to change their ways, all right? So in the end, it's not really so much the geography or the people that are encountered here that make these differences. It's really who's coming here that helps explain some of the early differences in these colonies, the New England region and the Virginia Chesapeake region. So to kind of do this and dig down in this a little bit more, let's return to these passenger lists. Remember in the last lecture on Virginia, I showed you a list of people heading to the Virginia colony. And I asked you to kind of look at those, look at that list of people. What can we tell about what kind of world they would make, right? Who are they? What are they going to do? How are they going to build a world from groups of people like this? Because these passenger lists are very indicative of who's going to these colonies at the time. Now here we have another group of passengers. What is interesting is it's the same exact year as the one we looked at going to Virginia, except this one is heading to New England. Specifically, this one's going to go to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It's going to land in Boston. So again, I'm going to ask you to kind of take a look at this passenger list and try to determine what does it mean for that society? How is it going to look and act? We did that with the Virginia one. We're going to do that here with the New England one as well. And do keep in mind that there is an extra credit activity that's tied to all of this. So you'll be getting a lot of the information that you'll want to use in that activity here in the lecture today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here in just a second. I want you to stop the video, look over this list or find the list in the extra credit activity and kind of stop and think about it. Work it down and say, what am I looking at here? Who are these people? What do I know about them? And what can that tell me about the world that they're going to create? Okay, so again, remember, a couple things that we have to keep in mind as we look through this passenger list. They're always going to give you the person's name. They're going to give you the person's age. They're going to group them by families if they know them. And then second of all, or lastly, they're also going to give you any of their occupations if they know them. Now, when we looked at the Virginia list of passengers, we realized they were coming over mainly as men. As individuals, there are very few that had the same last names, and very few of them were grouped together, even if they did have the same last names. So we can assume that they were probably not family members or they were distant family members. And there were very few women involved, right? And they're extremely young. So we saw that's important when you think that ship after ship that arrives in Virginia is full of people like this. And because most of those people didn't have job titles after their names, we can assume that almost all of them were indentured servants. People that had to go over to Virginia because that's how they could afford to get to those colonies. They didn't have any money back home in England to be able to sail over on their own. So they had to work for somebody else so that they could eventually claim land and start building up their own personal wealth. And we talked about the ways that would actually impact that colony, how it would kind of change the way it would act and the way wealth was kind of built, and actually kind of how different groups of people might have a little bit more freedom than they normally would, right? Especially for women in Virginia. They're going to get opportunities in Virginia that they would not have in any other place, even here in New England. So do the same thing we did with that Virginia passenger list with this list, okay? I'm going to stop, so keep in mind these things of name, age, family groupings, occupations, and stop and see what you notice in this list, and then try to think about what that means for New England, all right? So I'll be back with you in just a second. All right, you should have stopped the video here, gone and taken a look at all this, kind of delved into this a little bit. So what are some things that should be popping out to you in this list? Well, first of all, there's a whole lot of different people showing up here, right? There are men, there are women, there are children, right? We can see that from their ages. We also notice that a lot of them are coming over in families. One common name for this particular community is a group called the Tuttle family. Here you have John Tuttle. He's 39 years old. He's called a mercer. What we would today call that is a shopkeeper. He's a store guy, right? He runs a little store, whatever it might be. His wife's name is Joan. She's 42 years of age. Coming with John and Joan are John Lawrence, William Lawrence, and Mary Lawrence. Now, this will be kind of an interesting thing. And again, it kind of describes what we're looking at here as a phenomenon, if you will. Who are John, William, and Mary Lawrence, and why are they with the Tuttles? We know they have to be part of the family because right after the Lawrence kids comes Abigail Tuttle, who is 6, Simon Tuttle, who's 4, and Sarah Tuttle, and John Tuttle, right? So these people, Abigail to John, have to be more than likely John and Joan's children. So who are these three, the Lawrences, that are in between? Well, the most likely answer is that they are Joan's children from her first husband, who was named Lawrence. So Joan is a widower, right? Or a widow. She's raising kids on her own. She decides the best way to get through life, or maybe she meets somebody she loves, whatever it might be. She decides the best thing to do here is get married and start a blended family, is what we would call it today, right? So she marries John Tuttle. They go on to have their own kids, but now her children from her first marriage are part of this family. And when they decide to move to these colonies, they're bringing everybody. Another possible answer here is that John Tuttle could have a sister who's passed away, and now he's raising his nieces and nephews, and he's bringing them with him when he decides to move to these new colonies in New England. But what I do want you to kind of understand is we're not talking about an individual or a husband and wife and maybe 1 or 2 kids deciding, hey, let's go over to these colonies and see what we can do there. When they come over, they're coming over in extended families, right? Here's one group of Tuttles here, which comprises almost 9 people. And then there's another group of Tuttles over here. Right? Now, Tuttle is a rather kind of common English name, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. But we can guess, based on how these manifests are done and what's happening during the period, that John Tuttle and Richard Tuttle are probably cousins. So this isn't just something that part of the family is deciding to do. It's not just one brother has decided, hey, I'm going to stay here in England, and another brother says, no, I'm going over to New England. They're saying, no, let's all go together, right? So this is a massive exodus, if you will, from England, and it's organized. Because if you stop and think about it, if you're John Tuttle, you have a business, you have money, and here you are bringing your kids, adopted or otherwise. You're bringing your kids, your 1-year-old, you're taking with you to this new place. You're going to want to be successful. You're going to want to make sure that you have everything you need to take care of your family. Because after all, you have some resources. I'm not saying that these are the most wealthy people in England. They by far and away are not. They are, most of them make up what we would today call the middle class. They're peoples like grocers, people that run shops. They make shoes. They do people's clothing. Some of them are linen weavers, so they make materials. Some of them take care of animals. Couriers are people that take care of horses and carriages, that kind of stuff. So a lot of these people have job skills. They have businesses. They actually have some wealth already. They may not be the richest people in their communities in England, but they do have access to resources that a lot of those people going to Virginia didn't have. So kind of keep that in mind, right? The fact that these are coming over as families, are they going to be as violent as New England, where you have a lot of young men trying to get rich quick because they know they might be dead in a few months? Right? Probably not. They're going to want to bring rules. They're going to want to bring a kind of a social structures with them. As a matter of fact, they're going to bring them with them whether they really intend to or not, because they're really kind of transferring their communities, right? As I mentioned, right, the John Tuttle and Richard Tuttle and their friends and other family members from these parts of England that are making these trips, they're going to act they're going to have the same connections here in this new colony as they had back home in England. So they're going to conduct themselves much differently here in New England than they would in Virginia. Something else that's going to be different. If you're one of those indentured servants in Virginia and you get sick, who's going to take care of you, right? The holder of your contract doesn't want to see you die. They're not vindictive, but there's also not a big incentive for them to take care of you. They want to take care of themselves and help their business grow. So if you're really sick, say you say worse, you have an accident that incapacitates you, nobody's going to take care of you the way you need to be taken care of. If you lose a limb in an accident, you're not worth anything to the person that needs you to work on their farm. They're going to release you from your contract. And you're not going to get anything because you weren't able to fill the contract out. But now you have to take care of yourself with a debilitating injury. Well, here in New England, that's going to be very different. You get sick, you probably have a family member that can take care of you and get you back to health. You get injured, you're going to have people in the family that can pick up the slack and keep things going. So not only is this going to be a more socially stable area, right, region, if you will, at least in the early years, it's also going to thrive a little bit more for survivability. Indeed, while the death rate in places like Virginia might be as high as 60-70% until the 1660s, here in New England, the death rate's around 20-30% in the first years, but by the 1660s, 1670s, it's actually a better place to live than even England is. You have a better chance of surviving in New England in the 1660s than you did in Old England in the 1660s. So it's pretty amazing what's happening here, right? How these English settlers are going to be able to kind of come into this new region, settle, and in some ways be successful from almost the beginning. Doesn't mean that there won't be setbacks. It doesn't mean that there won't be death, that there won't be problems in this society. We're going to kind of look at a lot of those things. But in the end, these New Englanders are going to grow a lot faster than we saw in the Chesapeake region, especially in the Virginia colony. The next thing we want to look at, though, is what's driving them to come here in the first place, to establish these colonies in the New England region. And to explain this, we're going to have to do something that we'll do quite often in the next few weeks. And that, of course, is go backwards a little bit from the 1600s to the late 1400s and early 1500s. So what we're talking about here is this driving impetus for a group of English Protestants to come to the New World and establish colonies in the 1600s is driven in the most part by something that happened in the early 1500s, a thing called the Reformation. So if you'll remember from one of our earlier lectures, keep in mind that in the early 1500s, Christianity in Europe was fundamentally changing. Since the end of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, there had been one Christian church that ruled over most of Europe. Not all of Europe, but most of it, especially the western part that we understand of as kind of Europe today, from Germany all the way to England and Ireland. Well, it had become the dominant religion of the area, of the region, and it definitely did not allow any to push back against that power and control, that central place of religion in Europe. Anybody that tried to devise a different version of Christianity or went against the church's power and authority was crushed, right? And that's what things like the Inquisition are, although that's in the 16th century. But that's what heretics were in the medieval period, were people that tried to amend or change the Christian church as it was known as in those periods. But here, after the things like the advent of the printing press and this age of exploration and then the Renaissance, during the beginnings of what we call the Enlightenment, there is starting to become some serious pushback to the Christian church. What we know of today as the Catholic Church was the church throughout Europe. But for a lot of people, it seemed to have lost its way here by the 1500s, right? By the late 15th century and early 16th century. Originally, most people in Europe saw the church, the Christian church, as their key to heaven, to salvation, to an afterlife of joy. In a very kind of sometimes harsh world that they lived in physically, the church promised them a better life after death. And the church was the key to this. You had to go to church, you had to listen to your priest, you had to listen to church authorities and do what the church told you to be able to have access to this afterlife. And of course, one of the things the church kind of relied on, besides going out and explaining God's will and God's message to people through church sermons, was to build religious centers, things like cathedrals and churches throughout Europe where people could come and congregate and get these religious messages. And of course, they wanted people to do good things, to live good lives, to be good Christians. Well, along the way, the Christian church started amending its operations to a degree. It started allowing people, especially the nobles, the wealthy, the powerful in Europe, to be able to kind of offset some of their bad deeds with good deeds. For example, one of the things that the church started to do, especially in the medieval period, was as nation states are growing, kings and queens were fighting each other, even though they were all Christians and the Christian church said you shouldn't kill other people. It was understood that sometimes you had to because of political or family or economic issues. Well, after you did something bad like going to war and killing people, what could you do to once again be good and go to heaven after you die? Well, the church started coming up with solutions for that. It's called indulgences. If you did something wrong, you could pay off that bad debt by doing good deeds. Well, by the 16th century, after hundreds of years of this indulgence practice, what had really kind of come out of this was if you were rich, had wealth, you could simply start just giving money to the church and they would pray for you. They would do good things for you with your money, and then you weren't bad anymore. And pretty soon, especially by the early 1500s, it seemed like the church was more interested in obtaining indulgences, money from people in Europe, than they were in actually carrying out their religious mission of getting people to know God and participating in their religious ceremonies. It seemed like money was more important than the religion that was behind everything. One person in particular kind of brought this home and really crystallized this seeming corruption that was seeming to spread throughout the Christian church. He was one of its ministers, priests, right? He's a Catholic priest at the time. His name is Martin Luther. He's a German, so he's in Central Europe. But in 1517, he's really had it. He's seen a lot of corruption. He knows a lot of church leaders who are more interested in how much money and power the church has rather than the mission that it's supposed to be doing. That it's not really taking care of people. It's not helping people find God anymore. That it's really just about amassing wealth and power. So he comes up with a list of 95 things he thinks are wrong with the Christian church, and he tacks them on a church door in Germany. And he's protected by a local noble who knows that the Catholic Church is going to come after Martin Luther, so he gives him a place of refuge. And then because of the printing press, Martin Luther's challenge to the church to clean itself up, to fix itself, actually spreads throughout Europe. Pretty soon, people are talking about this, saying, you know what, I think he has a point. I think we need to fix the church. Other people are saying, no, the church is fine. It's worked for 1,000 years. Let's just leave it alone. And of course, this leads to religious conflict. Pretty soon you have people that follow Luther saying they're protesting the church and its policies, and others saying, no, we support it wholly, completely. We don't see anything wrong with that. Pretty soon we have this remaking of Christianity in Europe. That what had been the Christian church becomes known as the Catholic Church. Those opposed to the Catholic Church, the old universal Christian church, they become known as Protestants, because it's not just Martin Luther. There's John Calvin, Jacob Hus, even earlier period in Hungary, right? There are all kinds of these different people calling out this corruption, saying that this Catholic Church has maybe gone down the wrong road here and needs to be fixed. But regardless, it leads to a lot of religious conflict. And pretty soon you have to start deciding what side you're on. France has Protestants and Catholics, but eventually it decides to stay within the Catholic Church and kind of forces Protestants out. Spain has no problem staying Catholic. They never even allowed Protestants really to enter their country. If they did, they stamped them out. That's what the Spanish Inquisition's all about. Getting rid of any outside religious influences, whether it be Judaism, Islam, or other types of Christianity. But this is happening all over Europe. And one place where it matters to our story that we're kind of looking at in this class is also the country of England has to make this choice. And here in the early 1500s, when Martin Luther and John Calvin and others are challenging church authority, comes an English king that has a unique problem. His name is Henry VIII. He's been married to the widow of his brother for about 15-20 years. Her name is Catherine of Aragon. And as far as we know, they've actually had a pretty good marriage up to this point. They have a daughter that they've had together. Her name is Mary. They've been a good family as far as we can tell, but they have had one problem that we're very aware of. They have not had a surviving son. They've had a few infants born, but none have survived. So they have one daughter and that's it. But under English laws, it's unclear whether Henry and Catherine's daughter, Mary, could actually inherit the throne and become the Queen of England on her own. It's never happened before. All monarchs of England have been men up to this point. So Henry is worried. He realizes that his wife just doesn't seem to be able to give him the son he feels he has to have. And he knows it's not him because he is cheating on his wife with other women and having kids with them. So he knows that it's his wife that's the problem here. So he says, look, I need a divorce. He goes to the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church. Henry VIII, is Catholic. He asked the Pope, can you give me a divorce so I can have a wife that can give me a son and keep my family on the throne of England? The Pope says, no, those are against our rules. Our church does not allow you to have multiple wives. You get one marriage, one wife, that's it. Well, Henry doesn't like that answer. And when he hears about this Reformation, he finds that for people like Martin Luther, the issue of how many times you're married to somebody, whether you can have a divorce, really isn't one of his 95 problems he has, right? He does not care about those kind of things. So Henry decides to join this Reformation. He renounces being a Catholic, becomes a Protestant. And because the king is doing this, a lot of people in England decide to follow suit. Henry quickly decides to get rid of the Catholic Church in England and make the English arm of the Catholic Church instead a Protestant church. So he essentially takes over all the Catholic cathedrals, all the Catholic churches, all the Catholic priests and bishops, and says, no, you're all Protestants now. You're following me. You're following my example. You're going to become Protestants. Why is he doing this? because if he makes them Protestants, then he can have whoever runs the Church of England, as he calls it, can give him his divorce, he can marry who he wants, and have the son he needs to take over when he dies. So he creates, Henry does, the Church of England. But he does have one fear here, that because there are so many former Catholics in this church, they may not actually do what he wants. They may still follow too many of the old Catholic rules and not give him his divorce. So he decides to do the one thing that really makes the most sense. He puts himself in charge of this church. Not in a day-to-day way, but the ultimate authority in the Church of England. The person that's supposed to protect the Church of England, this now Protestant church, from anybody else is the King of England. So in some ways, Henry VIII kind of brings together church and state together. And he makes the Church of England the official Church of England, which means people have to pay taxes to support it. You can still belong to something else like the Catholic Church, but you're going to pay taxes to the Church of England so they can keep their cathedrals, keep their priests, keep their churches. For Henry, this works out. Because he controls the Church of England, he can give himself his divorce, he can get married again and again, right? The old joke, right? 7 wives of Henry VIII, or the 6 wives of Henry VIII. He goes through this over and over again until eventually he has the son that he so desperately wants that can take over for him. But at the time of his death, Henry's kind of made a mess of religion in England. Most people in England have followed the king's lead and become Protestant, but there are still a large number of Catholics in England. The Reformation is not something that takes just a couple of years to settle. It's something that takes almost a couple centuries to settle throughout Europe. So this leaves England in kind of a precarious position, if you will, during this period. And it gets even more precarious when Henry dies. And his young son dies as well and can't really, he's too young. He's only 4 at the time of Henry's death. And within a few months, he's dead as well, probably from disease, but we don't really know for sure what ends his life. But in the end, this question of whether a woman can become the Queen of England has to be answered. And Henry's oldest child, right? He has actually several daughters, but his oldest child is Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. And Mary has been raised by her mother. And something to kind of remember, Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Ferdinand II of Spain. That name should be kind of familiar to you because he's the Ferdinand of Ferdinand and Isabella that gave Columbus his ships in 1492. So Catherine's parents are Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And at this point, when her father, Henry VIII, dies, Mary is the granddaughter of the most powerful family in Europe at this time, right? Her uncle and cousins run Spain. They're some of the most powerful people in the world right now. And she has been raised in Spain. When her father got his divorce, her mother, Catherine, took her back to Spain to be raised as a good Catholic. So Mary, now that she's come back to England after her father's death and her younger brother's death, she's come back with kind of a score to settle, if you will. She wants to kind of get back at the people that kind of abused her mother, turned their backs on her mother, allowed her mother to be cast out of the country, right? Catherine of Aragon had actually done a lot for England, supported Henry when he was trying to stay on the throne, take over parts of Scotland. So so Mary wants to kind of rectify what she thinks are some grievances. When she takes over the throne of England, she has a lot of people in England supporting her, good Catholics that want to see a Catholic on the throne again and get rid of this Church of England, make it Catholic again. And she starts attacking these Protestants that supported her father, that were going to support her younger brother over her. She puts some of them in prison. She forces some of them out of the country. She even has a few executed. And that really scares a lot of people in England. They're afraid that this queen just might kill some of them. So in 1558, when it seems like she's getting more and more out of control, some of these powerful Protestant family members in England go to the younger sister of Mary and ask her, what would she do if she were queen? Now, in some ways, I'm kind of fictionalizing this and just kind of paraphrasing it, taking a lot of liberties here. But essentially what happens is a group of powerful Protestants go to Mary's younger sister, Elizabeth, and ask her what kind of queen she would be. They know, these Protestants know, that Mary is much like her mother. She's a fierce Catholic. And they suspect something about Elizabeth. And when they ask her, Elizabeth says essentially, I'm my father's daughter, right? I'm going to do what my dad did. My dad became a Protestant. I was raised a Protestant. I'm going to be a Protestant. I'm not going to attack people. I'm not going to execute them. I'm not going to take their lands and their wealth as punishment. I'm going to kind of take care of people. And that's what these guys want to hear. They think she's on their side. So they rise up against Queen Mary. They install Elizabeth I as the queen. Elizabeth I knows that she's in trouble, that if Mary ever gets out and finds help from other Catholics in England, that she'll be the one thrown in jail. So she has her sister executed. So it's a pretty rough thing that's happening here. This Reformation has a lot of consequences in a lot of unintended ways. But when Elizabeth has her sister executed, she definitely is now in charge of the country. There's nobody really left to kind of go against her as far as, Henry's offspring. They're all gone now. She's the only surviving child of Henry, or at least legitimate child that can inherit the throne. And the Catholics in England are kind of broken. They don't have anybody to rally around. They don't have anybody to support. Protestants are in absolute control of England now. So here during this period in the 1560s, 1570s, as Elizabeth I kind of consolidates her power, this is when England truly becomes a Protestant country. There's still going to be Catholics there, but they're not going to be allowed to perform their religion the way they used to. They're going to be forced to pay taxes to support a Protestant church, whether they like it or not. Sometimes they're even going to be forced to go to Protestant religious services, whether they like it or not. So there's a lot happening here. This becomes a very Protestant country. And one of the ways Protestants kind of try to show their allegiance to Protestantism, that they're not Catholics, is to do what's called a conversion experience, to show that they've had a personal connection to God, a moment where they've met God in their heart or in their mind, and that they're now part of this community, this religious community of Protestantism. That having a very public conversion experience, as it's called, becomes kind of central to kind of religion here in the 16th century in England. And it very much becomes a part of the Protestant religious community. So we see kind of Protestantism is really growing and becoming dominant here in England during this period. And that's an important thing, right? Because even though Protestantism is taking over, Protestantism is not universal, right? There's not just one form of Protestant. As I tried to point out on our slide with Martin Luther, he's not the only person pushing back against the Catholic Church. There are a whole host of people saying, this is how I think Christianity should be done. I think this is the way to do things. Well, that process doesn't stop. Here in England, as they're kind of pushing Catholics to the edge of society, if you will, comes this back and forth of exactly what does it mean to be Protestant, right? And a lot of Protestants are starting to feel that England is still too Catholic. even though the Catholicism is no longer in charge of England, that there's still too many vestiges of Catholicism left in English society, especially in the Church of England. And it leads to this idea that they need to purify England further of these Catholic remnants, right? And that's where we get an important word for today's lecture, Puritanism. Now, one American commentator from the middle of the 20th century, we today call him a political pundit, but he was a politician and a writer and all those kind of things. His name's Henry Mencken, and he summed up Puritanism in this way, that Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. Now, that's just kind of a sarcastic way of explaining Puritanism. But there is this idea at the core of Puritanism that there are very serious, dour people that really want to make everybody kind of be the same and act the same. And the origins of that, in some ways, there's some truth to it, right? If you look at the picture in the lower right-hand corner, that is an early Puritan from here in the 17th century, or in the 1600s, a little while after what we're talking about in the last slide. He's a serious person thinking about serious things, and he's reading his Bible on a daily basis, right? These Puritans do, Protestants do, in general, do that on a daily basis. But you'll notice something in this picture. Not only does this gentleman have a Bible in his hand, but he also has a sword on his hip, right? They're willing to fight for this stuff. They believe in it so strongly. They were willing to overthrow a queen to keep it, and they're really willing to do a lot of things to enhance it, right? So here during this period when Queen Elizabeth is the Queen of England, and even when the next monarch comes along, James I, who Jamestown is named after, who follows Queen Elizabeth onto the throne of England, these Puritans, as they call themselves, are starting to be a growing force in England. They're Protestants like most of the rest of England, but they definitely have this idea that Protestantism hasn't done enough yet, that it hasn't fixed all the problems. You see, they look at that Church of England and they say, look, we're still doing some of the things the Catholics did that we didn't like. We still have bishops and priests that run things. We have all these lands that the Church of England controls, just like the Catholic Church controls a bunch of land. And most importantly, we still allow indulgences, this ability for you to give money to the church so that you can feel good about yourself and be absolved of any bad things you've done. Well, a lot of Puritans say that it doesn't work that way. You can't just give money to a church and say, now I'm forgiven for all the bad things I've done. They say the only way you can really get to heaven is if you read your Bible each day, not listen to a priest tell you what's in the Bible, but actually read it for yourself. That you have to, by reading the Bible, you communicate with God. You have to pray directly to God in your own home. You don't just go to a church and have religion there. Religion is a daily part of your life, right? You and God have a relationship. That's how these Puritans are thinking about things. So even though they're Protestants, these Puritans are a radical form of Protestantism. They want to change that Church of England a lot more. They don't think it's gone far enough. That's where their name comes from. They want to purify things. For them, you just can't do these practices like these communions like they do in the Catholic Church or in the Church of England and go to heaven. It's more than that. You have to work a lot harder at it. So here during both Elizabeth's reign and into James I's reign, these Puritans, as they're emerging and solidifying, they're becoming more and more important. They put Elizabeth on the throne, and now they're starting to become leaders of the Church of England. They're starting to talk about getting rid of all of this stuff, get rid of all this church land, get rid of all these church taxes, get rid of these indulgences, and fix the Church of England. But that is not what this guy wants to hear. And by this guy, I mean the person in the upper left or upper right-hand corner. He is the King of England, Charles I, that takes the throne after James I dies. James I was originally a Scotsman, but he was a cousin to Henry VIII, right, or through legal marriage, I believe. Well, Charles the First is James the First's cousin. And because there aren't any people in the English royal families of high enough level to claim the throne, they offer the throne to Charles the First. And he accepts. And here in the early 1600s, the 1620s, this is the man that's in charge of England now. And he has a problem. These Puritans have decided that the Anglican Church, which is a nickname for the Church of England, is still acting too Catholic for them. Now, they're Protestants, but that's not good enough for Puritans. They want to cleanse or purify that church. But that is bad for you, Charles I, King of England, because who's the head of this church that is taking in money from taxes, that is taking in money from indulgences, that has lots of land available to it? Well, you are. This is one of your big revenue streams. And these guys, these Puritans, are talking about getting rid of it. Not only that, these Puritans are also saying you can tell who is the people that God loves because they're successful. They're visible in our world, right? God knows who's a good person and a bad person. So if you're not a good person, he's punishing you. And if you are a good person, he's rewarding you. So who are the rich people that are doing well that you should listen to? Generally, they're Puritans, right? Because they've self-defined themselves as successful and self-defined themselves as people that God is happy with. You should follow them and listen to them. Well, for Charles I, this is bad. If you listen to these Puritans, who are now becoming members or leaders in the Church of England, are actually helping run the English government for Charles, they're threatening your world, right? They're threatening of actually kind of taking over the place and you're just going to be a figurehead, really. So for Charles I, this is about kind of regaining control, if you will, keeping that valuable revenue stream, but also making sure these Puritans don't push you out of power. So he works with the head of the Church of England, William Laud, and he says, look, I'm going to remove Puritans from political office, you're going to remove Puritans from church offices, and we're going to start getting rid of them one way or another. So as they're being kind of persecuted, as the Church of England says, no, these Puritans are wrong, they're doing things the wrong way, we need to remove them, chastise them, publicly humiliate them, leaders in the Puritan Church are afraid. They're thinking, hey, look, we're being removed from positions of government, we're being removed from positions within the church, we're in trouble here. If we get ostracized, we could get thrown in jail. Some of us have been thrown in jail, and it's not too much farther than they start executing us, confiscating our lands and our wealth. Things can get bad for us. And it's here in the 1620s where some of these Puritans start fleeing to other places, famously going to places like the Netherlands to try and find religious freedom there, to kind of practice their form of Protestantism. Well, that is kind of what happens next. As this starts playing out, some of these Puritan leaders, people like a guy by the name of Jonathan Winthrop, start going to the King of England, Charles II, and say, look, you're not happy with us, you don't like us. We notice that you don't like having us around, but instead of you persecuting us, how about you allow us to leave? Let us set up our own colony in the New World. For Charles, this is kind of a win-win situation. You get rid of a group of people you don't like, that are bothering you, and they're going to set up a colony for you. Now, true, Charles I isn't going to get a lot of money out of this, but it is a place for resources, it'll be commerce, it'll help grow the English Empire. So he says yes. And in 1629, Charles I gives permission to a large number of Protestants called Puritans to start establishing their own colonies. They've actually already done it. That Plymouth colony, the Pilgrims from the famous stories of our childhood and the first Thanksgiving, right? They've already shown it's possible in 1620. They're still there by the late 1600s or 1620s. So the Puritans know it's possible to do this. They've just got to organize themselves and pull it off. So here in 1629, a huge group of Puritans, led by one of their church leaders, a guy by the name of John Winthrop, decide we're going to create a charter, we're going to organize a colony, and we're going to ship hundreds, eventually thousands of people over to this new colony and establish a Puritan colony. The point? To prove that their way of doing things is right. So to do this, they establish a colony government in their charter. They're going to have a colonial assembly, they're going to have a governor, and both of those things are going to be run by them. You have to be members of their Puritan church to become a member of the assembly, to be a member of the church, and to be the governor, right? So for these guys, they're going to kind of marry their religion and their colonial authority all together into one thing. But they are going to have rules, and they are English, and they are under the King of England. As bad as things are in England, they're all still English. It's just these Puritans want to show that their way is the right way. So here in 1630, they begin this huge migration from England to these New England colonies, the Massachusetts Bay Colony being one of the first and largest of these. And what we kind of see is they're well laid out, planned out communities. As these groups of people come over, sometimes like on that passenger list, a bunch of families all from the same region in England come over at the same time to reestablish a new town here in these New England colonies. What'll happen is the government of Massachusetts, led by the governor, one of their own members of their churches, will say, look, we're going to give you this amount of land here on the map that is now yours. Sometimes, like in Dedham, Massachusetts, which is today part of Boston, Massachusetts, it was given 100,000 acres to the first 46 families that showed up. The first thing they did, of course, was build a church. Of course, that makes sense, right? These people are being motivated by their religion. But keep in mind, that church is going to do a lot of things. Yes, it's going to be where they hold religious services, but it's also going to be where they teach their kids to read and write. If you're going to be a good Christian, in their opinion, you have to be able to read your Bible, so you have to know how to read. So for these Puritans, a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted in our world today, they're saying are bedrocks of their world too. They want people to have economic opportunity. They want people to have the opportunity to practice the religion the way they see they should, right? And they're establishing that kind of way of doing things. But they also believe in things like public education. It's important for everybody, regardless of how much wealth they have, to be able to read their Bible. So it is also these churches in the centers of their towns are also going to be the places where they have their town meetings, their regional colonial meetings will be in their churches. So for them, the world kind of revolves around their religion. It's not a theocracy. It doesn't mean that the church law is the only law. There are secular laws and there are church laws. But it is okay for the same people to have multiple roles or jobs within their colonial structure. John Winthrop is a church leader, but he's also their governor. And they're perfectly okay with that. It makes sense to them. He's a good man who God loves. That's why he's a church leader. Why shouldn't we put him in charge of our government as well? Why shouldn't our church leaders also be the people in our colonial assembly writing our laws? If they're good enough moral people to run our religious assemblies, they should be able to run our secular assembly, right? And that's kind of how they've done it. They've kind of fused these things together. But kind of keep in mind, something different is happening here. While they do want to make sure kids are educated, that's very different than the Chesapeake. There are children in the Chesapeake, right? But there's smaller number because there's fewer families in these early years. Eventually, they'll even out. But at first, there's fewer children, so there's less need for schooling in the Chesapeake region. Something else that's very different, again, the town of Dedham has lots of land. Now imagine if you gave people in the Chesapeake, Virginia, here's 100,000 acres. What do you think they would try and do with it as quickly as they could? Well, the answer that should have sprung to mind here is grow tobacco. and grow as much of it as you can, as quickly as you can, to make as much money as you can. But here in Dedham, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it's very different. You get enough land to take care of your family, and that's about it. Because they're not going to be able to grow tobacco in New England. It's too cold, the growing season is too short, the soil is too poor to really kind of grow that kind of a crop. Agriculture is not going to be the way forward for New England. They're not going to have a cash crop that's going to make them rich. They'll be able to grow enough food to support themselves, but it's not going to be an exportable commodity that's going to make New England rich. So there's something else going on here, right? This is called New England for a reason. It's going to look a lot more like Old England than the Chesapeake is. There is a different world being created in a lot of ways. Even though they're all English and speak the same language and come from the same place, they are doing something different, fundamentally different there in the Virginia colony than they are up in here. This is much more like England's economy, where you have a lot of small towns, people living in those small towns with small farms around them supporting them. And then there's commerce between each other. People in the towns make goods and services for the people on the farms. The people on the farms grow food for the people in the towns, and they sell things back and forth to each other. Much more familiar to us as far as our economy is today. So a couple other things to kind of keep in mind. This is a charter colony like in Virginia. It means that somebody other than the English government actually runs this colony. So who's in charge of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for example? Well, really, it's the colonists of Massachusetts Bay. And that is a unique feature if you stop and think about it. That is not happening in the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, or even the Dutch Empire, although that it's a little closer. But in the French Empire and the Spanish Empire, it is their monarchs of their home European countries that run and control those colonies. They make the decisions, they appoint the people that run those colonies. But here in places like Virginia, you've got a colonial assembly that can at least make some decisions. True, they have a governor that's appointed first by the Virginia Company and then later by the King of England, but at least they have some say and have a lot of authority through that colonial assembly, the House of Burgesses. Same is true in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They have a lot of power, and because their governor is appointed by them, they actually have a lot more power. They can do virtually anything they want in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Another thing that's kind of common here is that if you're a landowner, you have a say in these governments, whether it be Virginia or Massachusetts Bay Colony. Owning land gives you a political voice. It doesn't have to be a ton of land, but the more you have, generally the louder that voice is in politics. It's why the House of Burgesses in Virginia is dominated by these big old families that have lots and lots of land, like the Washingtons, like the Jeffersons, like the Monroes and everybody else, right? Here in New England, it's going to be a little different, but still, owning land is a key feature. If you own land, you're a member of the church, you have a right to participate politically in this colony and have some authority in the colony, to cast votes, that kind of thing, hold office. So that's a little different than would be back home in England. Back home in England, you just have to own land. You don't have to be the member of a church. In Virginia, you just have to own land. You do not have to be a member of a particular church or a religious sect to actually have political power. This is a unique feature only in New England. Another thing to kind of keep in mind is different here in New England. Not all Puritans are the same. There are some Puritans that are trying to change the Church of England from the inside. They're Congregationalists. They say, look, the Church of England's not all bad. We just got to fix some of the things we don't like, and it's fine. Then there are others called dissenters that say, no, it's pretty much all bad. We need to wipe it out and just put something else better in its place, right? And they're a little bit more radical. And for the most part, those are the types of Puritans that are coming over to places like Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, one thing that all Puritans can agree on, regardless of how they feel about the Church of England, is that you have to attend religious services to really prove you're a member of the community, right? It doesn't mean necessarily that you have to have a church in your family, right? But you have to attend church, whether it be in an actual physical church or just somebody's house. You have to go to religious meetings to kind of prove you're a part of the group. And then, of course, you have to be baptized into the church of these Puritans, right? So what I mean by that is, when you're born in one of these Puritan families, you are baptized into their particular community church, and you're always going to be a member of that community. So how does it get bigger? Well, by having more kids, and that makes sense, right? The more kids they have, the more members of that particular community church there are, and the bigger it grows. And sometimes these church will blend together, and neighboring towns or neighboring communities will combine their churches together and create a bigger and bigger church. And that's perfectly fine. But what happens when somebody leaves it? Well, the minute you leave, you're out. Let's say you marry somebody from a neighboring community that's not part of your particular Puritan church. Well, now when you have kids, they can't be a member of either church because both parents aren't a member of the same church. So what you kind of see is these Puritans can sometimes be very focused, right? They can be very exclusionary. They can really say it's just us that are real Puritans, right? And they can acknowledge that other people are Puritans like them, but there is a sense of close-knit community here, right? That they don't accept outsiders really well. And what I'm trying to point out to you is down the road, this is not going to go well for these Puritans. They are so exclusionary sometimes that they make it difficult to actually keep their numbers growing, especially as more and more outsiders come along. Because keep this in mind. Let's say you're somebody back home in England that's not a Puritan. You're just one of the many other Protestants out there in England. You want to go over to the New World to get some of this cheap land that seems to be available over there. After all, these Puritans are selling some of this land to people that aren't Puritans as a way to raise money to buy things that they need. So you have options if you're a Puritan in England, or if you're a Protestant in England. You could go to the Virginia colony and take a chance there and get some land, or you could go to the New England colonies. And for the most part, you might go to New England because the chances of you dying right away are a lot slimmer than in Virginia. And it's a lot more stable, and it's a lot more familiar, and you'll fit in better. So what you're going to notice is pretty soon, it's going to be hard for these Puritans to keep people coming to their churches. When they say, hey, both of your parents have to be members of our church for you to be a member of our church, that becomes more difficult as more and more non-Puritans start showing up in Massachusetts and other colonies. So what I'm trying to point out for you guys, these Puritans have a mission, if you will. They want to prove that their way of life is the right way. They want to prove that people should live their lives according to these Puritan structures, right? Strictures, that they're the ones that understand truly what God wants. But at the same time, this kind of religious fervor can only last so long, right? After a couple of generations, their kids and grandkids aren't going to see this as a religious experiment to prove that the Puritan way is the right way. They're just going to see it as life. And they're not going to be as interested in proving if they're right or wrong religiously to other Protestants. They're not going to notice a huge difference between other Protestants and themselves, right? So we kind of notice these Puritans are going to have some struggles here. And this baptismal rite that limits who can be members of their Puritan churches really shows us how much challenges are coming up in the future for them. But the one thing we can say is for these early years, especially these first 15 to 20 years, from about 1620 to 1640, thousands, actually tens of thousands of Puritans leave England and head over to New England and help establish these colonies, which helps explain why there's so many more people living in these northern colonies than Virginia and Maryland, even though Virginia's been around for 30 more years, yet it has fewer people than the entire New England region, right? Virginia itself has more people than any individual colony, but all of New England physically is about the same size and has way more people. So there's a lot going on here in New England that we have to kind of keep in mind. And the way I would kind of explain all this and kind of put some of these things that I'm talking about now into kind of a context is to take a look at this picture. This would be a picture, a painting, a rendition of what a Puritan church meeting might be like in 17th century England in the early 1600s. These different people, most of whom are from what we would today call the middle class, are coming together discussing something, maybe after a church service or before a church service. So this is one of those secular meetings, one of those non-religious meetings that this religious group is having. And here you have two men debating, right? They're standing up talking to each other. What's interesting is we don't know who's the person that's in charge or not. Maybe it's the guy with the collar on the left side. Maybe it's the guy in the black smock on the right side. We're not sure, actually, right? I mean, it's hard to tell from the picture. We do know that the person on the left side is probably wearing church garb, so he's probably one of the leaders of the church itself. But that doesn't mean that he is in charge of everything, right? So what I'm trying to point out here is, in these church meetings, actually everybody has a chance to speak their mind, to kind of advise what they think is the right course for the group, for the community. They're going to have pretty open and wild debates. As long as you're a member of the community, you have a right to be heard. But once this committee, once this group of people comes together and makes a decision, then it's expected to adhere to that decision. Because these Puritans are very much about being successful, about getting results. They don't want people to continue to fight back after they've lost an argument. If you've lost your argument, we're moving on. That is now settled business, on to the next thing. And that is something to kind of keep in mind. There is a lot of freedom in this Puritan society, but it only goes so far. It has to be within the structure that they've created. There are rules to follow, and everybody kind of has to follow those rules. If you don't, you can find yourself on the wrong side of the community. And that's what brings us to a series of questions. One of our sources in our chapters, especially this for chapter 2, is a letter, or actually a list of objections and answers by one of these church leaders, this guy that's going to be the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop. And in this document, he gives a bunch of reasons why these Puritans need to leave England, why they shouldn't just stay in England and try to deal with the king and try to make him happy and try to fix the Church of England. He's going to tell his followers in his community, we have to leave. England's not safe anymore. And essentially, he says, look, England is too corrupt. The people like King Charles I are dangerous and may turn on us. He says that we want to spread our faith, and if we don't leave England, we can't prove that the Puritan way is the right way. And then he also says, look, the rest of Europe is just as corrupt as England. So those Puritans that think they can move to the Netherlands and they'll be safe, they're wrong. Because eventually some Catholic or some other Protestant group is going to come and wipe them out too. We're better off just going someplace where we'll be safe and we can do things the way we want to do things. So he's telling his followers in this document, look, we have to leave. We can't stay here. Only bad things are going to happen if we stay here, and we won't really fulfill our mission in life. We won't really show what the Puritan way of life should be, right? Now, one thing that he doesn't say in this document to convince people to take on this endeavor is he doesn't say we're going to gain wealth. So this isn't like Jamestown. He's not saying, hey, look, come with me on this adventure, I'll get you rich. because they're not interested in that. Because remember, to a Puritan, if God likes you and you're a good person, you are successful. Those things are synonymous to them. If you're somebody that's poor and bad things happen to you all the time, there's a reason. It's because you're a bad person and God's punishing you, right? To them, it is obvious who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. You can just see it on the streets of England, right? So he doesn't have to convince you to come over here by promising you the wealth of Native Americans or just digging up gold and silver or anything like that. He's going to talk to you about what matters to them, right? Their ideas of faith, their ideas of religious ideas, right? That's at the core of his message. Another thing that does come up, though, in this document is that some of the members of Winthrop's religious community say, hey, I get that you want us to go to the New World, but doesn't somebody already live there? Isn't this territory that you're talking about already claimed, lived on by another group of people? And Winthrop answers those objections as well, right? These concerns that they have. He says, look, you're right, but they need to learn to be English, right? They need to learn English, they need to read the Bible, and they should become good Protestants. Because after all, if we don't go over there and make them good Protestants, good Puritans, then eventually some Catholic missionary from France or Spain will show up and turn them into Catholics, and then that's horrible, right? To these Puritans, nothing could be worse than that. He also points out, look, they're being wiped out by disease. So again, the fact that God is sending diseases to wipe these natives out means God wants us to go here. He's literally paving the way for us. So this is pretty wild thinking on his part. But again, right, he falls well into this idea that if bad things happen to you, you're on the wrong side of God, right? These Puritans very much believe in those kind of visible clues, if you will. And then he also says this refrain that's becoming quite common amongst Europeans when they deal with Native Americans. He says they don't hold the land. What he means by that is that they don't use the land correctly. Yeah, they grow a little bit of food, but they don't build farms like we build farms. They don't have fences. They don't have family plots and territory, right? They're not doing things the right way. So again, there's this idea that because natives don't live the way the English do, that they are somehow uncivilized and unentitled to ownership of the land, right? Then that means the English can come in and just take it. It's up for grabs. After all, sometimes the natives leave for 2 or 3 months at a time. You don't just leave your land, right? You keep it, you hold it. And because of all of these things, Winthrop and a lot of other English people say, we can take all this land that we want. The one thing that never shows up in Winthrop's document is that these Puritans are actually going to come over, negotiate with the natives, and buy the land from them. They just don't think they have to, right? Again, they've discounted the civilization of the natives and just said that they're a part of the environment that's there to be taken over and done away with if we want to. So what's happening here, right, is this idea that we Puritans need to kind of go. Now, not all Puritans are going to feel this way, but a huge number, again, tens of thousands, are going to decide, like Winthrop, we need to leave. They're going to debate these things out in their meetings, but once they come to a conclusion, once their community's decided, yes, we're going to go, no, we're not, that's it, right? We're all on board now. If they take a vote in here and they decide, yes, we're going to pick up and we're going to move our community, you can't say, well, no, I'm sorry, guys, I'm staying anyways. You're part of this. You had your say. You said, no, it's a stupid idea. We voted yes. We outvoted you. You're coming. They're serious, right? They want to get this done, and they want to be as prepared and careful about it as possible. Because if they fail, it means, well, what does it mean? If you're a failure, if you're poor, if you're destitute, if God's hitting you with diseases and you're dying, it means you're wrong. It means you're not loved by God. So for these Puritans, they have to do this right the first time. They have to be an example for all to follow. That's what on the title slide, that city upon the hill means. People like John Winthrop are saying, we need to be the example for all others to follow. We need to be the example for others to live their lives by. We're going to show what's possible here, what needs to be done, and we're going to do it. And because we're doing it, it means God's on our side. It's a self-fulfillment, if you will, right? So for these Protestants, they have a lot riding on this. So they're going to want to be as organized as possible. They're going to want to be as prepared as possible, and they will be. It's one of the reasons why they're going to be so successful compared to what's happening in the Chesapeake, why their death rates are so much lower, because they're bringing a lot more food. They're bringing a lot more equipment. They have multiple generations of people, right? They have a lot of experience and skills. They're going to pull off a lot here. It's still going to be rough. It's going to be hard. But in the end, they're going to be quite successful. And kind of keep this in mind, right? 1630, the Massachusetts Bay Colony with John Winthrop is started. By 1634, there's a Connecticut colony started by another Puritan minister by the name of Thomas Hooker. Another colony by the name of Rhode Island is officially created in 1644, but it's about a decade older than that, really, right? Starts in the 1630s by Roger Williams, who actually leaves the Massachusetts Bay Colony with a bunch of families and heads there. The New Hampshire colony is actually a part of Massachusetts originally, and then becomes part of its own colony in the 1670s, right? So you can see within just a few years, there's quite a few of these Puritan colonies. They have so many people coming to them, so many people leaving from England. And then, of course, because they're families, they're having kids from almost the very beginning, something that Virginia and even Maryland really aren't doing for a long time, or at least for several decades before they're kind of their gender ratios balance out and they start kind of organically growing their populations. This starts almost immediately in the New England region. And of course, that's a big deal if you stop and think about it, right? Because they're multi-generational, they have so many kids, there's a lot of labor there. You don't need a lot of indentured servants. In that passenger list I showed you at the beginning, there are indentured servants on that list, but there are only a few of them. Right, and they're kind of at the end, the very end of the list over on the right-hand column. There are a lot of servants listed on there, but we mean actual servants, people that are like butlers or maids or cooks for people, right? So that's how wealthy some of these people are, that they can bring over servants to help run their households, to do things for them. So these Puritans, they're organized. They're going to bring a lot of creature comforts with them because they have some wealth and they have an education and all that. They're going to want to make sure their kids have access to all of these things. So they're going to be much more prepared. This region's going to grow much faster than what we saw down in Virginia and even by extension Maryland or the Carolinas. Something else that's going to happen, though, is that it's just not going to be as common to die from disease here. Even though the growing season's shorter, even though the soil isn't as good as Virginia, they're actually going to be healthier up here. Your chances of dying as a child in New England in 1670 are actually about 1 in 10, when it's about 50-50 in England, and maybe even worse, about 40-60 of you living if you were born in France or parts of Germany. So why? Why from the very beginning of these New England colonies, do they have more people being born in their colonies than dying in their colonies? Well, part of it is this community, right? Somebody gets sick, there's people to take care of them. Part of it is the fact that they have more supplies, they have better supplies to bring with them, so the chances of starving in the first couple years is a lot lower. The other part that's a big part of it is the climate. There's a big difference between Virginia and New England in the wintertime. Both places get cold, but New England gets way colder. Both places see snow, but New England sees a lot more of it for a much longer period of time. So why is that important? Well, keep in mind, what happens in the winter to things like rodents and mosquitoes? Well, they go dormant or they die off, right? So here in New England, the chances of being bitten by an insect in the winter are almost zero. But you could be bitten by an insect virtually 9-10 months out of the year in Virginia. So your chances of getting a disease transmitted to you in Virginia almost never ends. Whereas in New England, for about 6 months of the year, you have a much less chance of dying from disease. So that's going to help grow this population as well. It's just going to be less deadly by nature, right? So for all those reasons, this region is just going to take off. So a couple other things to kind of keep in mind is the fact that this migration again is huge. In 15 years, from when John Winthrop first asked King Charles I for permission to create a Puritan colony in the New World, about 20,000 Puritans are going to leave England. Now, it's only a tiny fraction of England's population. England's population at the time is probably close to 3-4 million people. But they are coming over in huge numbers, establishing their own little communities and making their own way into things, right? And it's going to help explain why they're going to be able to grow so quickly. Is there's just more people coming all the time, more supplies, more commerce, more connections to England. It is just easier to survive every way, shape, or form. Another thing we kind of want to take a look at here is the fact that as these Puritans develop these colonies, they're going to have an enormous influence, not just on their immediate world, but even over a longer period of time, even after Puritanism, as it's called, is gone, right? This idea of how you're supposed to live your life. The Puritan way of life can only last so long, right? Again, it's a very kind of a constricted lifestyle. A lot of non-Puritans aren't going to put up with a lot of this, especially when they have land and wealth of their own. So what we're going to see is Puritans have an impact on their world, but in maybe different ways than we would think, right? One of the ways we kind of see this, the impact of Puritanism over the long period of New England history is in its architecture. For example, this is a picture of a home built in the 1760s outside of Boston. What you'll notice is this is actually a very wealthy person's home. We know that because of who owned the house, right? We have the records from the period. But just looking at it, we can actually tell it's a wealthy person's house because it has so much brick and so much glass. Both of those things have to be imported from England. They're not made in the New England colonies. So you have to be really wealthy to afford this house. And yet, they are not showing it off. They're not trying to flaunt their wealth. They don't have to. Who in town knows that they're wealthy and doing well? Everybody. They see these people every single day. They're members of the community. And it's not just in your house that you kind of stay simple, right? In your social behavior, you act much like everybody else does. Whether you're rich or poor, you're kind of expected to act the same way. That's how we're all on the same page. That's how our community is successful. And we prove that our Puritan way of life is the way of life everybody should follow. We do that in the way we dress, if possible. We do it in the way we build our homes. So people being people, however, if you're rich, you're still going to have a bigger house than somebody that's poor. If you're rich, you'll build out of brick. Somebody that's poor will build out of wood. So you're still able to kind of show off, but you don't want to show off too much because then you're just kind of flaunting it and you're kind of being demeaning the community that way. So what is interesting is these Puritans have kind of a lot of restrictions on the way people conduct themselves. And even after Puritans are gone, as in the case of this house, people will still kind of follow those social conventions even when the reasons behind them no longer exist. It just becomes a part of their way of life in New England. And some of it, some vestiges of it still exist to this day. Can also see it again in their manner of dress. Here's again a wealthy family in New England, an infant and mother, and again, they're dressed kind of simply, honestly, if you stop and look at that, but again, not so simple, right? The mother has a bunch of lace on her shoulders. That is actually really expensive. The material her dress is made from is expensive. So while she dresses simply, she doesn't show a lot of jewelry. She doesn't show off a lot of expensive detail work, that kind of stuff. She doesn't have to. What her clothes are made out of tells people she's doing really well, right? Another way to kind of think about this is the social structure of this Puritan world that, again, is going to have some impact long term, right? The idea that you have to dress kind of appropriately in New England society is going to outlast the Puritans. Well, some other things that are going to outlast the Puritans are kind of the structure of their society. Because of the way English society, actually European society is, it's a very patriarchal one in a lot of ways. Men are kind of the center of the leadership roles of these communities. Now, it doesn't mean women don't have a place and don't have some authority. They do. But in the end, the men are the heads of households, and they make the major decisions for the community. What is interesting, however, in the Puritan community is that, for the most part, if you're a member of the community, you'll be given land, which means you have a voice in the community. And essentially, at any given time, about 10% of the community is in what we would consider government positions, right? Things like sheriffs, things like secretaries of committees, church leaders, all that kind of stuff. So on average, during your lifetime, regardless of whether you're very poor or very rich, you're going to get a chance to serve in the government of this colony, either in the religious side of it or on the secular governmental side of it. You're going to have a voice here. And again, they want that, right? They want people to be able to be a part of this, to speak their mind. It's how you get buy-in, how you get people to participate and actually care about the decisions you're making, is by making them a part of the process. It makes sense to Puritans in a lot of ways. Well, that's going to kind of rub off, right? Because Puritans want to make sure everybody has an education, everybody actually can participate in these endeavors, right? They can be governmental authorities because they know how to read and write even if they're poor. And it's going to mean that a lot of people in New England think they should have a say in how their government runs. After all, they're running their own individual colonies. They don't really answer to anybody back home in England. They do things themselves. And those attitudes are going to hang on after these Puritans kind of depart the scene and they just become English, right? Protestants in a very generalized way. So those are some important things to kind of keep in mind. Now, for the other part of society, women, this is not the way they're going to be allowed to participate, right? Anne Hutchinson is a perfect example of sometimes the stultifying nature of this system that the Puritans have created. So let me tell you her story as quickly as I can. Anne Hutchinson is a Puritan who back home in England agrees with John Winthrop that the Puritans need to leave England. It's too dangerous. Her husband thinks, no, we should probably just stay here in England, or if we're really worried, we should just go to some other part of Europe because it's familiar, it's safe, and we probably won't die. But Anne Hutchinson believes in this religious experiment, right? This idea of proving to the world that that the Puritan way is the right way and people should do things like the Puritans do. She supports John Winthrop. She wants her husband to support John Winthrop in these church meetings, so he does, right? And when time comes and the Massachusetts Bay Colony is set up, Anne Hutchinson convinces her husband it's their turn to go. They need to go and help run this colony and keep it going. So they pick up their family from England and move to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And for the first few years, Anne Hutchinson is doing everything she can to help John Winthrop and the leaders of their church build the best colony they possibly can. She wants her husband to be involved in things, but he's not really interested in that. Right now, he's just trying to get their family income back. He's trying to establish his businesses again. That's where most of his focus is. She, on the other hand, is much more interested in these big philosophical and religious issues that are at the heart of Puritanism. And she feels that this colony still isn't quite right, that it hasn't done everything it needs to do yet, that people like John Winthrop are way too focused on kind of power and controlling the society than they are on living a godly life. So she starts holding religious services in her home, trying to convince people that, no, we probably need new leaders here. People like John Winthrop have done a good job getting the colony set up, but they don't seem to be able to take it to the next level, so to speak. And pretty soon she finds herself in hot water. She is arrested by the church leaders, put in jail, and put on trial in their local court. Right? So again, how you can kind of marry church and state together in one place, right? Breaking religious rules can get you in trouble in a very real secular way, governmental way, right? So Anne Hutchinson is going to be put on trial for breaking a bunch of laws in this Puritan world. And the reason I'm bringing her up and what happens to her is I need to show you why this world can't exist that long, why these Puritans just can't keep this going over the long haul, right? Why this is a very short-term phenomenon that's going to burn out by the 1690s, right? And they're just going to become Protestants like a lot of other English people by that point. So to understand what happens to Anne Hutchinson and ultimately Puritanism altogether, you need to understand a couple of things. The Puritans understand that there are things called natural laws and then what we would today call moral or civil laws. That's how they describe them, right? So what's the difference? Well, a natural law is lions hunt sheep, right? Although that's technically not right because those animals don't coexist in the same areas, but you get the point, right? Predators track and eat prey. We don't get upset with a lion for killing a sheep because it's just doing its job, so to speak. But that doesn't mean what it did was good, right? It's just natural. So we create laws because we're better than animals like lions to say what is right and wrong. That's what moral and civil laws are. We need those laws to make sure we don't do bad things. We create stoplights so that we don't kill each other when we come to an intersection, because if we didn't have stoplights, all of us would go 80 miles an hour through the intersection and kill each other, right? So that's what Puritans kind of divide their world up into. They say because people can sometimes do bad things, we need laws that control people's actions. And we have to follow those laws or we're just like the animals, which means we can't carry out God's work, right? Make sense? Okay. So Anne Hutchinson is actually going to be accused of breaking a lot of these moral and civil laws. But she's also going to be accused of breaking some natural laws. So they're really upset with her, right? She's going to be basically breaking all laws whatsoever. Laws of nature, there's just the way people are, and then laws given to us by God to help us run a godly society. She's broken them all. So John Winthrop, who actually needed Anne Hutchinson's help in getting this colony started, puts Anne Hutchinson on trial for breaking these laws, for committing crimes. And he says that she's done a lot of horrible things. He accuses her of troubling the peace of the colony, that she's causing problems. Again, remember, they've made their decision, they've come here, they've set up their colony, they can't squabble and argue about stuff anymore. They just need to move forward here. She won't allow that to happen. She says the people in charge, like John Winthrop, aren't doing their job right. They cannot stand that. They also accuse her of holding religious meetings in her home. Now, that should be okay, right? We said that sometimes Puritans, it's like you don't have to go to a church, you just have to have religious meetings so that you can be with God, right? So that you can show your connection to God. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is she held them, not her husband. It's okay to have religious meetings in the home as long as the husband leads them. She was the actual one leading them, right? So she broke a law. She also disparaged the leaders of the colony, both secular and religious. In this case, John Winthrop. He was kind of, she disparaged him. She said bad things about him. She said he was stupid, that he wasn't doing things right. He took umbrage at that and decided to put her on trial. The one thing she was not accused of, however, is witchcraft. So again, we're not at that point, right? These are very serious things that they're arguing about. They really do believe in these philosophical ideas that they're arguing over, right? So it's not about witchcraft that happened, like in the famous trials of Salem in 1692. This is something else entirely. It's about how this society functions and what's expected of you, a Puritan in this society that they've created in these colonies in New England. Now, after she's put on trial, she's given a chance to defend herself. She tries, and after a while, she's found guilty. So when they punish her, they do not burn her at the stake, and they do not put her in jail forever. Both of those would be pretty extreme and would kind of show fear of the leadership towards her, right? So they do the thing that makes the most sense. They banish her. They say, look, if you can't get along with us, you can't stay with us either, right? It is in a very real way, it is our way or the highway, right? Follow the line, do what you're told, or get out. Well, she decides to get out, all right? She doesn't have any other choices. That's actually what's leading to the creation of things like Rhode Island and Connecticut, right? That's what's actually spurring on the growth of these colonies. As these Puritans bicker and argue with themselves over things, they eventually turn to each other and say, I can't stand you anymore, leave. And that's what happens to Anne Hutchinson. The colony of Massachusetts Bay says, we can't stand you anymore. She has to leave. When she goes home after being convicted, her husband says, you're on your own. I'm not going with you. And she and some of her children go, and her husband and some of their children stay, right? So this is what's going to happen over and over again in these colonies. And it's why they're not going to survive forever, right? Like after 60 years or so, they just kind of get taken over by more generalized secular versions of themselves, just very generic Protestant versions of themselves. Because you just can't exist with this kind of fervor, this kind of ideology for that long, right? All right, so kind of moving on, right? While this patriarchy and this very centralized system of control is powerful, especially in its early years in New England, it's not the only thing that defines these colonies. Education is an important part of it, as I mentioned, right? They want people to be able to read their Bibles. And by the 1760s, some of the most literate people in the English Empire were in New England. They made a lot of schools. They created places like Harvard and Yale very quickly in their periods, right? Think about this. Harvard in Boston is started, and it's not a university back then, and it's definitely not a prestigious, world-renowned university when it's created, as it is today, but it is a school, right? And in 1636, 6 years after the colony of Massachusetts Bay is started in Boston, they've got a place to teach people how to be teachers, doctors, lawyers, right? That's what Harvard starts out as. Yale does that in Connecticut, right? It takes longer, but within 60 years, they've got it. Jamestown starts in 1607 in the Virginia colony, and it's not until the 1690s that they have their own version of a Harvard or Yale. So it takes almost 100 years to do this in the Chesapeake region. Much quicker in New England because of all the factors we talked about earlier. Another thing we have to kind of keep in mind is this intolerance that we saw with Anne Hutchinson. It's very real. And it's not just about women knowing their place in their society. that they have to listen to their husbands and follow the rules, and if they don't like it, they can't do anything about it. Right? It's happening to everybody. Roger Williams points out that, hey, look, not everybody here in our community is a Puritan from members of our church, but they should have a say in things. You shouldn't have to be a member of our church to hold a place in our government. He's told to get out, just like Anne Hutchinson, and he has to leave. As a matter of fact, he and Anne Hutchinson both kind of helped create the colony of Rhode Island, but then she leaves from there as well because she thinks that that place is still too Puritan for her, right? Thomas Hooker is another person in the Massachusetts Bay Colony that says, look, just because you don't have to be a member of the church to have political rights. If you own land, you should have political rights. That's how it is back home in England. That's how it should be here. He's told to leave. So he goes and helps create the colony of Connecticut, where they do exactly that, where they give people political rights regardless of what their religious ideas are. So what we kind of see is there is a lot of intolerance in this Puritan society. And again, it's why this society isn't going to be able to carry on forever, right? After 2 or 3 generations, they're burning out on all of this stuff. And they're just kind of saying, look, let's just find some generic formula that works for all of us. We won't worry about the Puritanism anymore. We won't be this holy experiment anymore. We're just part of our world now, right? We're commerce with England, with the other colonies. That's really what our life is. So you kind of see this world that they're creating is fascinating, it's interesting, it's different at first than what you'll see in almost any other part of England or its empire, but it starts kind of moving towards the mean, towards the more normalized parts of English society as it grows up. Same is going to be true of Virginia and the Chesapeake. What starts out as a kind of a Wild West woolly frontier where, a lot of violence and a lot of, fast money will slowly kind of gentrify and solidify just like New England is. So a lot happening here in these colonies in their early years to kind of keep in mind. Now, the next couple things I want to wrap up with here, and we are getting to the end, I do promise it, right, is I do want to point out how does New England actually build itself up and support all of these people? We know how they're doing it in the Jamestown, Virginia colony, and that's through growing tobacco and using a lot of labor. So what are they doing in New England to kind of stimulate their economy? Is it going to be through growing something like a cash crop like tobacco, or is it going to be something else? And the honest answer is it's something else, right? The land is not worthless, definitely not bad. It is good land, but it's not great land. It's good enough to support your family on, grow enough food to keep you alive, but it's not good enough to grow crops that'll make you rich. And on top of that is this kind of community idea that the Puritans have in their early days of sharing as much area as they can, that all of us will turn our pigs and cows into this big giant pasture and we'll all use it together. What's ironic about that is that's how Native Americans would use the land, right? And yet these Puritans are saying that the natives aren't using the lands right. But in the end, the land in and of itself isn't going to make New Englanders rich. There's no reason to own 5,000 acres in New England. It's just not going to be valuable for you. What can make you money is commerce. And to have commerce in the 17th century, you need ships. So fishing is a way to make money. Building the ships to move everything, including that tobacco from from the Chesapeake, right, is a big thing that New England will be doing because they do have lots of trees and lots of forests. So we see that from the very beginning, right? Boston is a port city. It's the first real settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And by 1646, it's only 15 years old, okay? And it's already the largest city in North America for the English. It's got about 20,000 people in it at the time. By the 1660s, it is far and away the largest city in English America, right? It'll be the largest city in English America until Philadelphia is established in the early 1700s. So from the very beginning, we kind of see that this commerce, these ports are going to be incredibly important for New England. because of fishing, because of trade. And one thing to kind of keep in mind is it's not going to be just important for New England. It's actually going to be important for England and its empire. In the 1660s, there are more than 300 ships that have been built in New England and are being sailed by New England, out of about 1,000 English ships. So 1/3 of England's ships are New England ships, right? So a lot of the wealth being created by those ships, by moving goods around the empire, are actually helping make people in New England rich as well, right? And of course, one of the things they're carrying, besides the fish, tobacco, timber, furs, is they're also going to be a key part of the slave trade. So even though New Englanders aren't really going to need slave labor, they will use some, but not much. They will have household slaves that they use as servants, but not always, right? They're not going to use slave labor like they do in the Chesapeake and places like Maryland and Virginia on the tobacco plantations. But they are going to be the ones bringing them from Africa to sell in the Caribbean and in the Chesapeake and the southern colonies. A lot of New Englanders are going to get rich out of buying and selling other human beings. So there's one thing we should understand from the very beginning that makes these colonies all have a common bond, and that is slavery. Whether they use slave labor like in the southern colonies or whether they sell and transport that slave labor like in New England, they all need it. They all use it to build up their wealth, right? Doesn't mean they could have found another way to do this, definitely, but they can't conceive of it at the time. To them, it just makes sense. It's the way to do it, so they do, and they become quite good at it. And New England benefits from slavery just as much as Virginia, Maryland, or any of the southern colonies. Now, another thing that we want to talk about is to understand the relationship of these Puritans with the Native Americans that they're displacing. And one thing that we do have to be honest about is that on at least some level, these Puritans really do want to convert natives. They do want to make them good Protestants like themselves, okay? So when people like the Pilgrims or John Winthrop and his Massachusetts Bay colonist Puritans come over, they do interact with the natives. They do try to get the natives to come to religious services, to adopt English manners and ways of doing things, dress like English people do. They do try to what they would call civilize the natives. To show you just how important this outreach program is to the natives, to Puritans, one of the first books printed in the New World in English. So that means they went and bought a printing press and then made books in New England, right, was a Bible. Now that's not surprising. That makes sense. They're the religion is the core part of their identity, right? But the fact is they printed it in Algonquin, the main language group of the natives in the New England region. So they actually wanted to get natives to read English Bibles and become Christians like themselves. So they went out and worked at converting natives. And sometimes they were actually fairly successful. They could get sometimes whole tribes to go ahead and convert. Some tribes thought, well, if we convert and we act like them and speak like them, maybe they'll leave us alone and we'll be able to survive. But it turns out that that was not going to happen any more than it is in the Chesapeake. It's not going to happen up in New England. Most natives, of course, are going to resist. They're going to say, hey, look, this is our identity. This is who we are. We're not changing for you. Those that do are going to find that no matter how Christian they become, no matter how good of English they speak, they're never going to be brought in and made part of these Puritan colonies. In the end, it is always us and them. Natives who do convert and become good Puritans are told to stay in their own communities, what the Puritans called praying towns. There's a good tribe over there. They pray like we do, the right way. but they can't come and live with us, right? They're not good enough to live with us. We're not going to intermarry with them. They're not going to be our family and friends, right? They are a distinct other out there. So that becomes kind of a commonality in English America, no matter where we're at. Now, again, there can be exceptions to this. There are times where the English go and live with the natives. There are times where the natives come and live with the English. But by and large, that is not what is happening. It is very much a us and them divide there, right? And it's usually the English that are enforcing that divide. And of course, this leads to a lot of conflict. So something that both the Virginia colony and the New England colonies have in common is a lot of conflict with their native neighbors. And that kind of makes sense because there's so many of these Puritans coming over, taking so much land so quickly. The natives have to do something or they're going to be wiped out. And essentially that happens over and over again. Every time one of these colonies is created, other than the Rhode Island colony, there's a war behind the creation of those colonies. A perfect example of this is Connecticut. When Thomas Hooker leads about 100 families, maybe about 1,000 people all told, to what is eventually going to be the state of Connecticut, they have to force out a group of people called the Pequots that live along the Connecticut River Valley. That war, called the Pequot War, ends in a disaster for the natives. The English just come in, these Puritans just come in and kill everybody, man, women, and children. They don't even care if they're Pequot or not. They just say, well, all the natives are the same, we're wiping you all out. And they do. And in the end, the Pequot are just forced out of their own home territory and absorbed by neighboring tribes. And the Puritan colony of Connecticut is created from that. But maybe the most famous example of these tensions between English settlers in the New England region and Native Americans is what happens in the 1670s, a thing called King Philip's War. So during this period, a leader of one of the tribes, the Algonquin language group, has a variety of tribes throughout the New England region, all the way down into what is Virginia today. And one of the leaders of those tribes, a person named Metacom, he has kind of seen the handwriting on the wall here. He sees that the English just keep taking over more and more, and no matter how much land they get, they always want more, and there's no stopping them. They constantly win. And at the same time that's happening, natives are being pushed off their land, being decimated by diseases. That if this is allowed to continue to go on, natives are going to be wiped out. So this guy Metacom starts traveling around the area, and he becomes well known. And a lot of the English settlers in the region know him as somebody important because he seems to be popping up all over the place. So they call him King Philip. He seems to be a big chief amongst a lot of different tribes. What they don't realize is he is trying to galvanize a confederation of tribes against the English. And in the 1670s, he does it. He gets virtually every tribe in the region to decide to go to war with the English. They're tired of the English constantly taking land. They're tired of being hit by these diseases. And he puts together an alliance to deal with the English. Out of about 90 settlements, about 100 different little communities created in these New England colonies, they're going to attack more than half of them, about 52 of them, which means they're virtually everywhere, these natives. They're attacking all over the place. They destroy, burn to the ground 12 of these towns, taking people prisoner, killing men, women, and children. The natives are going to do to the English what the English have been doing to them for years now. It is a brutal conflict that goes on for about a year. At the end of the year, about 4,000 different Algonquin-speaking people, natives, have been killed. About 2,000 English people have been killed in this war. Pretty brutal losses for both sides, and pretty close in the grand scheme of things numbers-wise, right? 2,000 and 4,000 are a lot, but it really tells you something is the percentage of the population we're talking about. Well, when you look at what this war's casualties mean, 2,000 dead English people means about 1 out of 25 settlers in New England is now dead or captured by the natives. That is a small percentage of the population. But 4,000 Algonquins means about 1 in 5 members of every tribe in the region has just been killed or captured. It is a devastating loss. And what is happening all the time while this war is taking place? More ships are showing up with more people, and the English are replacing whatever losses they did have. So this war, like all the others, ends up being a bit of a disaster for the natives. It just allows the Europeans, the English settlers, to look at the natives and say, there are no good natives. They're all the same. They're all against us. Treat them all the same. So while there can still be individual alliances from time to time between the English and native groups, for the most part, they see each other as enemies, and they treat each other as enemies for most of their existence. Now, we finally made it to the end here, right? You did it. So a couple conclusions to kind of keep in mind here. First and foremost, New England and this Chesapeake region we looked at last time are really different, right? Keep that in mind. New England is dominated by families, organized religious groups in its beginnings. Chesapeake dominated by individuals looking out for themselves, right? Religion was a central fact of life in New England. It's not that it was absent in Virginia, it just wasn't the focus, right? It wasn't a big deal. It wasn't what drove you on a daily basis. Economic gain is what drove a lot of people in the Chesapeake on an individual basis, right? New England doesn't have a cash crop like tobacco. For the most part, it's going to be forced into trade to create its wealth. While Virginia and much of the southern colonies rely on tobacco as a way to make money, New England's going to be the one transporting that tobacco and the labor to grow that tobacco. That's what New England's going to do to get rich. Also kind of keep in mind this. There are, despite all these differences, a lot of similarities. They are all English, right? Keep that in mind. They speak the same language. They often come from the same places, right? They believe in having some political power. Land wealth should give you a voice in your community, right? That is something that's common in both places. They follow the same laws. They have the same kings, right? All of that is the same. And also, they often see natives the same way, as just something that's out there that needs to be pushed away and take the land and do something that they consider to be useful with it. So that's kind of the beginnings of English America here in these 2 lectures. And we're going to kind of see how they evolve farther from that in the next few lectures, and then how all of this fits together in a greater context called the English and eventually the British empires. All right? So until next time, I'll see you.